The morning she called about the chocolates, I knew something was wrong before she even finished the first sentence. Her voice was careful, too careful, like she was stepping around something invisible. "Did you enjoy them, Gerald?" she asked. "The ones I left on your porch?" I remember standing by the kitchen sink at the time, rinsing out my coffee cup, watching the last of the snow melt along the fence line. I didn't answer right away. Not because I needed to think of something clever, just instinct. Something in me said, "Wait." "Oh, those," I said finally. "I gave them to my accountant. She took them home for her grandkids. Said they loved them." There was a pause on the line, not long, maybe 3 seconds, but it felt stretched. "You, what?" she said, and for the first time her voice cracked just slightly. Those were expensive, Gerald. I ordered them specially for you." "That's very kind," I said. I dried my hands slowly, buying myself time I didn't really need. "Margaret will be touched when I tell her." She didn't respond to that. Not really. There was a small sound, almost like she'd started to speak and then stopped. And then the line went dead. No goodbye. I stood there for a moment longer, still holding the dish towel, listening to the silence in the kitchen. The chocolates were sitting right behind me on the counter, unopened. Exactly where I'd left them. I hadn't given them to anyone. But that reaction, that wasn't about generosity. That wasn't someone disappointed their gift hadn't been appreciated. That was something else. I turned and looked at the box. Dark ribbon, clean edges. One of those boutique places that charge more for packaging than product. It looked perfect. Too perfect, maybe. I didn't touch it. Looking back now, I think that was the moment everything shifted. Not the discovery later, not the evidence, not the police, just that quiet pause on the phone. Because it told me something simple. She had expected me to eat them, and she had not expected me to say what I said. I carried the box over to the table and sat down, just staring at it. I tried to reason with myself, tried to pull things back to something normal. Maybe I was reading too much into it. People react strangely all the time. Maybe she was embarrassed. Maybe she'd spent too much money. Maybe... But the truth is, this wasn't the first thing that hadn't sat right. It had been building, slowly, quietly. And the kind of thing you can ignore for a long time, because none of it, on its own, is enough to justify concern. A question here, a visit there, a drawer slightly out of place. Nothing you can point to and say, this is wrong, but together. I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I didn't think much of it at the time, I would tell people later. That's not entirely true. I thought enough of it to lie. And that's what bothers me most, even now, because somewhere, without saying it out loud, I already knew something wasn't right. I just hadn't admitted it yet. Outside, a cardinal landed on the cedar hedge near the fence, bright red against the dull grey of the sky. It stayed there for a moment, then hopped along the branch like it had somewhere important to be. I watched it longer than I needed to. Then I reached for my phone. Not to call the police, not yet. I called my accountant. "Pat," I said when she picked up, "I need you to do me a favor, quietly." There was a pause on her end. The kind that comes from knowing me well enough to recognize when I'm not asking casually. "What kind of favor?" she asked. I looked at the box again. "Testing," I said. "Food testing. Discreet." Another pause. "Gerald," she said slowly. "What's going on?" I hesitated just for a second. "Probably nothing," I said. "But I'd like to be sure." She didn't push after that. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. "Bring them by," she said. "I'll make some calls." I hung up, stood there for a moment, then reached for the box, carefully. Like it might matter, like it already did. "My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 67 years old," I spent most of my working life as a forensic accountant. 32 years in Ottawa, the last few consulting on financial crimes cases. You learn certain habits in that line of work. You notice patterns, small inconsistencies, things that don't quite sit right. And you learn, maybe more importantly, that people rarely do something once. There's almost always a trail, but none of that felt relevant 4 years ago when Diane died. That, that was something else entirely. Ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. I still remember the exact morning the doctor used the word advanced. Diane squeezed my hand under the table, like she was the one reassuring me. That was her way. She had this warmth about her, the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday without writing it down. They too kept little notes about what people liked, favourite tea, favourite dessert, and made sure they had it when they visited. After she was gone, the house didn't feel empty exactly. It felt dimmer, quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful. I kept everything the same at first. Her chair by the window, the small shelf in my study where she used to leave her reading glasses. Even the kettle. Same one, even though it had started to whistle a bit unevenly. I suppose I thought if I didn't change anything, I wouldn't have to admit how much had. My son Colin lives about 20 minutes away. He's 41 now, good man, always has been, Keith. We've never been the kind of family that says everything out loud. We show up, we help when it matters, that's always been enough. He works as a project manager for a civil engineering firm, travels occasionally, long days, but he makes time. And then there's Sophie, she's 8. If there's anything in this world that still feels uncomplicated to me, it's her. She has Diane's eyes, same grey-green colour. I used to joke they looked like a lake in late November. Quiet, a little mysterious. And she collects things, not toys, not gadgets, and little things, stones, leaves, bits of glass she finds on the ground. She calls it our museum. There's a shelf in my study where we keep everything she brings. Every time she visits, she adds something new. Or at least, she used to. I didn't notice right away when that changed. Looking back, I should have. Colin married Renata about 8 years ago. I want to be fair here. I've had a lifetime of judging situations, and fairness matters. When I first met her, I tried. Diane tried harder. Renata came from a very different background. Her family had money, oil and gas out west from what I understood. She carried herself differently. Not unkind, just certain, like she already knew how things should be. Diane used to say, she'll soften with time. Maybe she would have, but Diane didn't get that time. After the funeral, something shifted. At first, it was subtle. Renata started coming along on visits more often, which was fine, welcome even. The house was too quiet, I didn't mind the company, but the tone of things changed. She started asking questions, casual ones on the surface. Have you ever thought about downsizing, Gerald? This place must be a lot to handle on your own. My cousin works in real estate. Properties around here have really gone up, haven't they? I answered politely. I changed the subject when I could. At the time, I told myself she was just making conversation. People talk about houses, about age, about practical things. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't quite right either. Then about 2 years ago, she started visiting on her own. Colin travels sometimes for work, 3-4 days at a stretch. During those times, she'd stop by. Just checking in. Brought you some groceries. Thought you might need anything. I appreciated it. I did, but I began to notice something. She always found a reason to be in my study. A book she wanted to see, a document she needed to print, a photo she said Sophie would like. I keep my important papers in a lockbox in the closet, fireproof, habit from years in the field. There's also a filing cabinet, older records, tax returns, property documents. Things I don't access often but keep organized. One afternoon, after she'd left, I went in there to grab something. The drawer wasn't closed properly. Now, that might sound small. It is small, but I've spent decades noticing how people handle things that aren't theirs. And I'm precise. Always have been. When I close something, it's closed. This wasn't. I stood there for a moment, just looking at it. Then I closed it. Said nothing, didn't mention it to Colin, didn't mention it to her, but I started paying attention. That's the thing about patterns. You don't need to understand them right away, you just need to notice. And once you start noticing, it's very hard to stop. It didn't escalate all at once. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear stories like this. Oh, they expect a moment, a clear line where everything suddenly becomes obvious. But it wasn't like that. It was gradual, almost polite. The questions kept coming, just spaced far enough apart that they never felt confrontational. Have you reviewed your will recently, Gerald? You know, things can get complicated if documents aren't updated. My friend had a situation with her father's estate. It turned into a mess, always delivered gently, thoughtfully, like she was doing me a favor by bringing it up. And every time I'd nod, give a neutral answer, move on. I didn't want conflict, not with Colin involved, not with Sophie in the middle of all of it. But I was watching. That became my default. Watching how she moved through the house, what she touched, what she lingered on just a second too long. And there was one afternoon, I remember it clearly, it was late fall, around 4 in the afternoon. The light was already starting to fade. She was in the study again, said she needed to print something for Sophie's school project. The printer had been acting up, she said, hers, not mine. I was in the kitchen making tea. I could hear the faint sound of drawers opening, not loudly, carefully. That's what stood out, carefully. I stood there with the kettle in my hand, listening, not moving, not announcing myself. Then the sound stopped. A moment later, she walked back into the kitchen, smiling. All set, she said. Your printer works better than mine. I smiled back. Said something polite. I don't even remember what, but I remember thinking she wasn't printing anything when she opened that drawer. And I remember something else too. Her hands were empty. That night, after she left, I went into the study again. The filing cabinet, second drawer. It was closed, but not the way I leave it. There's a resistance when you push it all the way in. A small click at the end. It's subtle, but it's there. This one hadn't clicked. I opened it. Nothing looked out of place, not obviously. Papers stacked the same way, folders aligned, but something had been disturbed. You get a feel for these things after a while. Not from what you see, but from what doesn't feel quite right. I didn't confront her. I didn't confront Colin. Instead, I made a quiet change. The next morning, I rearranged a few documents. Nothing dramatic, just enough that I would know if someone had gone through them again. A folded corner here, a paper slightly out of alignment there, small markers, the kind no one would notice unless they were looking for them. 3 days later, she came by again. Same routine, same smile, same easy conversation. And again, she found her way into the study. This time, I didn't stay in the kitchen. I walked down the hallway, slow enough not to startle her, but deliberate. She was standing near the cabinet when I stepped into the doorway. Oh, she said, turning slightly. I was just looking for that book you mentioned the other day. I nodded. Second shelf, left side. She smiled, moved to the shelf, pulled out a book almost immediately, too quickly, like she already knew where it was, or like she hadn't really been looking for it at all. I didn't say anything, just stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then I turned and walked away. Later that evening, after she'd gone, I checked the drawer again. The folded corner, flattened, the paper I'd shifted, moved. That's when it stopped being a feeling and became something else. I remember sitting down in the study chair, just staring at the cabinet, trying to make sense of it in a way that didn't immediately lead to the worst possible conclusion. Because the worst conclusion, that wasn't something I wanted to believe. Not about her, not about someone in my own family, but the truth is, belief doesn't change what's happening. And something was happening. I just didn't know how far it went yet, or how much it was going to cost. The chocolates sat on my counter for 3 days before I took them to Pat. I walked past them more times than I can count, made coffee beside them, read the paper with them just there, like they belonged in my kitchen. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that this was how suspicion works. You notice one thing, then everything starts to feel connected. A drawer, a question, a gift. You string them together until they become a story. And stories can be wrong. I've seen that happen more times than I care to remember. Still, I didn't open the box. On the third morning, I woke up earlier than usual, couldn't quite settle back into sleep. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets just before sunrise. I made tea, stood by the window for a bit, then looked over at the counter. The ribbon was still perfectly tied, untouched. I don't know what finally made the decision for me. Maybe it wasn't one thing, maybe it was the accumulation of all of it. I picked up the box, put it in a plain grocery bag, and drove to Pat's office. And she didn't ask many questions when I handed it to her, just raised an eyebrow slightly, the way she does when she's trying to decide whether I'm being cautious or paranoid. "Any reason in particular?" she asked. I hesitated. "Something feels off," I said. "I can't prove it yet." She studied me for a second longer, then nodded. "All right," she said. "I'll make a few calls. Give me a couple of days." I thanked her and left. The drive home felt longer than usual. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to find a version of events where this all made sense without what I was starting to suspect. I didn't find one. The call came 3 days later. I was in the kitchen again. Same spot, more or less. Funny how things circle back like that. "Gerald," Pat said. Her voice was different this time, more deliberate. "Yes, there's something in them." I didn't speak right away. "What kind of something, Begins?" I asked. "A chemical compound," she said. "Injected into 3 of the chocolates on the bottom layer. Very precise. Small needle marks underneath. You wouldn't see them unless you were looking." I sat down slowly. "Go on." "The lab identified it as aconitine." I closed my eyes for a second. I knew the name. Most people wouldn't. But I did. Derived from monk's hood. A plant that grows in parts of Canada, used ornamentally. Easy enough to obtain if you know where to look. In the right dose, it interferes with the heart, not dramatically, not in a way that draws attention, can look like something natural, especially in someone older. "How much?" I asked. There was a pause. "Enough to be dangerous," she said. "Possibly fatal, depending on how many pieces were consumed." I let that sit for a moment. The kitchen felt smaller somehow. "Are you certain?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Yes," she said quietly. I thanked her, hung up. Then I just sat there, hands resting on the table, looking at nothing in particular. It's strange the way your mind works in moments like that. You'd expect panic, anger, something immediate. What I felt was stillness, like everything had just locked into place. All the small things, the questions, the visits, the drawer, they weren't separate anymore, they were connected. I stood up after a while, walked over to the sink, and poured myself a glass of water. My hand was steady, that surprised me. I took a sip, set the glass down, and looked out the window. The backyard looked the same as it always did. Fence, our maple tree, the patch of ground where we used to flood a skating rink in winter. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I didn't call the police. People always ask me about that. Why not go straight to them? The answer is simple, even if it doesn't sound that way. One piece of evidence isn't enough, not when you understand how these things get challenged, how easily doubt can be introduced, chain of custody, contamination, alternate explanations. I'd seen cases fall apart on less. If I was going to do this, I needed more, not just proof of intent, proof of pattern, because no one does something like this. Just once. I walked back to the table, picked up my phone, and scrolled to a number I hadn't needed in a while. Douglas, my lawyer. He answered on the second ring. "Gerald, everything all right?" So I looked at the empty space on the counter where the chocolates had been. "No," I said. "I think we need to review my will." There was a pause. "When did you last update it?" he asked. 2019, I said, after Diane passed. Another pause. "Come by tomorrow," he said. "Let me pull your file." I agreed, hung up, and for the first time since Pat's court, I felt something else. Not fear, not exactly, something closer to certainty. Whatever this was, it didn't start with chocolates, and it wasn't going to end there. Douglas called me back the next morning, earlier than I expected. "Gerald," he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Careful, measured. "When did you say you last updated your will?" 2019, I said again, after Diane passed. "That's what I have on file," he replied. "Yeah, but I'm looking at another document here, dated October last year." I didn't speak. "It's been, modified," he continued. "Significantly." "In what way?" He paused, like he was choosing his words. "The primary inheritance structure has been changed. The trust for Sophie is gone. Everything now passes directly to Colin. And there's a clause. If anything happens to him, incapacity or otherwise, it all transfers to his spouse." I leaned back slowly in my chair. "That's not my signature," I said. "I didn't think it was," he replied. "You need to come in." I drove to his office that afternoon. It was one of those grey days where the sky doesn't quite commit to snow or rain. Everything felt suspended. Douglas had the document laid out on his desk when I walked in. At first glance it looked legitimate. Clean formatting, proper language, even the signature, close enough that most people wouldn't question it. But I'd spent too many years looking at documents like this. There were small things, the pressure of the pen, the spacing, the way the letters connected. It wasn't mine. "Notarized," Douglas said, pointing to the stamp. "Service out of Gatineau." I nodded, but my attention was elsewhere. October 14th. I stared at the date for a moment. Then I looked up at him. "I was in Montreal that day," I said. "Conference for retired financial professionals. I still have the registration email, hotel receipt, probably photos from the dinner." He held my gaze for a second, then nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "That helps." We sat down after that, and for the next 2 hours we mapped it out, and not perfectly, not completely, but enough to see the shape of it. She'd had access to my study, to old documents, samples of my signature. From there, it wouldn't be difficult for someone determined enough to create something convincing. The notarization, that was the weak point. Douglas mentioned there had been some irregularities flagged recently with certain services across the river. Looser verification, corners cut. It fit too well. "The will is the structure," I said at one point, more to myself than to him. He nodded. "And something else would be needed to trigger it." I didn't answer that. I didn't have to. We both knew. I sat there for a moment, looking at the document again. Careful, planned, not rushed. This hadn't been impulsive. It had been built. Over time. "What do you want to do?" Douglas asked. I leaned forward, rested my hands on the desk. "We don't go to the police yet," I said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Not until we have everything," I continued. "I want the full picture, financials, accounts, anything that connects back to her. If there's a structure here, there's money moving somewhere." He considered that for a moment. "All right," he said, "but we do this properly." "Of course." I stood to leave, then paused. "There's something else," I said. He looked up. "My son," I added. "Colin?" "What about him?" I hesitated. "I don't believe he knows," I said slowly. "But I need to be sure." Douglas nodded once. "Careful with that," he said. If he's unaware, you don't want to tip anything off prematurely. I know, and I did. That was the part that sat heaviest. Because this wasn't just about documents anymore, or money. It was about family. I drove home in silence, didn't turn on the radio, didn't make any calls, just thought about Colin, about Sophie, about the way she used to run into the house without knocking, straight to the study to show me whatever she'd found that day, a stone, feather. Once, a bottle cap she thought looked important. I smiled at that despite everything. Then I remembered something, the last few visits. She hadn't brought anything. I hadn't questioned it at the time. Children grow, interests change, but now it felt different. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment before going inside. The house looked the same as always, but I knew, walking up those steps, I wasn't looking at things the same way anymore. Inside, I went straight to the study, opened the cabinet, looked at the files, everything still in place, careful, precise. I closed the drawer slowly, and at this time, I listened for the click. I chose a Saturday morning to talk to Colin. It felt intentional. Weekends have a different rhythm, slower, fewer interruptions. Sophie was at a birthday party and Ranita was out, yoga class, I think. I didn't want an audience. I didn't want noise. Just the truth, in a quiet room. He opened the door looking a little surprised to see me unannounced but not concerned. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Everything okay?" "Can we sit?" I asked. That was enough for him to step aside. We went to the kitchen, same table he'd probably sat at 100 times before. I placed the folder in front of him and didn't say anything. He looked at it, then at me. "What's this?" "Just take a look." He opened it slowly. I watched his face more than the papers. First, confusion, brows pulling together slightly, and then concentration as he started reading. Then something else, something heavier. He turned a page, stopped, went back, read it again, the lab report. His hand paused there. "The chocolates," he said, but didn't finish. "I didn't eat them," I said quietly. "I had them tested." He nodded, but it didn't look like the information had settled yet. He kept going. The will, Douglas's notes, the timeline, the small financial transfers Pat had uncovered. Nothing large enough to trigger alarms individually, but consistent, quiet, directed into an account tied to a numbered company. He closed the folder halfway, then opened it again, like he wasn't sure if stopping would make it more real or less. We didn't speak for a while. There's a kind of silence that fills a room when something fundamental breaks, not loudly, not dramatically, just settles.
"Dad," he said finally. Then nothing. I could see it happening in real time, the pieces rearranging in his mind, the version of his life he thought he understood. Shifting. "I know," I said. "That was all. Because what else do you say?" He leaned back in his chair, ran both hands over his face. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "It doesn't. She wouldn't." He stopped himself, because even as he said it, he was looking at the evidence. "I went over that thought more times than I can count," I said, trying to find another explanation. "And?" he asked, looking up at me. I shook my head. He stared at the table for a long moment. Then quieter, almost to himself. "The will?" "It's not mine," I said, "and I can prove I wasn't there the day it was signed." He nodded slowly. "And the account?" he asked. Pat traced what she could.
It leads back to a company connected to her. Not directly, but enough. He let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting in his chest for days. "I didn't know," he said. I met his eyes. "I believe you," and I did. That wasn't something I said lightly. I'd gone through every possibility before I walked into that house, every angle, every outcome. There was nothing that suggested he was part of it. Just caught in the middle. He looked down again, hands resting flat on the table now. "What happens next?" he asked. "Douglas is building the case," I said, "and we'll bring in the police, properly, with everything in place." He nodded, then after a moment, "Sophie." That was the part neither of us wanted to touch but couldn't avoid. "She doesn't know any of this," I said. "And she shouldn't. Not yet." He swallowed.
She's been different. I've noticed," I said. He looked up again, something like realization crossing his face. "She told me last week the museum was babyish," he said. "That she didn't want to bring things anymore." I felt something tighten in my chest. "She didn't come up with that on her own," I said. He didn't argue. We sat there for a while after that, not talking, just letting it settle. Outside, I could hear a car pass, tires on wet pavement. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, and then stopped. Normal sounds. That's the strange part. The world doesn't pause for things like this. Eventually, Colin straightened up. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Everything you can remember," I said. "Conversations, documents, anything that might help establish a timeline." He nodded. "And one more thing," I added.
He waited. "You need to think carefully about what comes next," I said. "For Sophie." That hung in the air between us. He didn't answer right away, but he understood. I could see that much. When I left, he walked me to the door. We didn't hug. That's not how we've ever been. But he put a hand on my shoulder for a second before I stepped outside. And that said enough. The police came into it about 2 weeks later. By then, Douglas had everything organized in a way that left very little room for interpretation. The lab report, the forged will, the timeline placing me in Montreal, the financial movements Pat had traced. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was structure. The investigation moved faster than I expected, maybe because the pieces were already there, maybe because cases like this, they don't get reported often. But when they do, people pay attention. I stayed out of most of it, answered questions when asked, provided documents, sat through a couple of formal interviews that felt more like conversations than interrogations. The hardest part wasn't any of that. It was waiting and watching. Colin had moved Sophie to his sister's place before anything happened. He didn't tell her why, just said it would be a sleepover, pancakes in the morning, a movie. She brought her little collection bag with her. That mattered to me more than anything else at the time. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. I didn't see it. Colin called me afterward. "It's done," he said. His voice was flat, not empty, just contained. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. The legal process took months, longer than I would have liked, shorter than I expected. Oh, in court, everything is slowed down, taken apart, examined piece by piece. Her defense tried to explain it away. The chocolates, contamination, they said, supply chain issue, a coincidence. The will, something she'd been asked to handle on my behalf. Each explanation reasonable on its own, but together they didn't hold too many connections, too many points where things overlapped just a little too neatly. The employee from the chocolate shop testified, remembered her, the purchase, the return visit, the notary service, cooperated eventually. And the financial trail, quiet as it had been, was still there, consistent, intentional. The jury didn't take long. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. I didn't look at her. I looked at Colin. He didn't react, not visibly, just sat there, hands folded, staring straight ahead. Some things don't show on the surface. Sentencing is still pending. I don't think about that part much. Justice, when it comes, is rarely as satisfying as people imagine. It's quieter than that, more like a line being drawn. Afterward, Colin filed for divorce. He didn't ask my opinion. He didn't need to. That was his decision to make, and he made it. Sophie started seeing a counsellor not long after. Someone who works with children going through family disruptions. She doesn't talk about it directly, not with me at least, but you can see it in small ways, The way she pauses before answering certain questions, the way she watches people more closely now. Children notice more than we think. They just don't always have the words for it. A few weeks ago, she came over for lunch, first time in a while, and she walked in a little slower than she used to. Looked around the house like she was checking if everything was still where she remembered. Then she smiled. Small, but real. "I brought something," she said. She reached into her bag and pulled out 3 things. A piece of green sea glass, smooth, worn down by time. A small brass button said it had been from one of Diane's old coats, and a folded piece of paper. I opened it later. It said, in her careful handwriting, "For Grandpa, our museum forever." I stood there in the study for a long time after she left, looking at that shelf, all those small things she'd collected over the years, things most people wouldn't think twice about, but to her, they mattered, and somehow that made them matter to me. It's been almost a year now. I still make tea in the morning. I still stand by the window sometimes, watching the backyard the way I always have. The maple tree Colin planted when he was 9 is taller than the fence now. The skating rink? I didn't flood it this winter. My back's been bothering me more than usual. Maybe next year. Sophie still texts me photos when she finds something new, asks if it's museum quality. I always tell her yes, because it always is. I've thought a lot about everything that happened, tried to understand it in a way that doesn't just reduce it to anger, and I keep coming back to the same thing. None of it started big, it started small. A question, a visit, a drawer left slightly open. That's how most things do. The mistake isn't that we miss it at first, it's that we ignore it once we notice. If there's anything I've learned after all these years, after everything, it's this: pay attention. Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then, because the people who truly care about you, they won't be offended by your caution. They'll be relieved by it. I'm still here. That's not something I take lightly anymore. And every Saturday, when Sophie walks through that door and heads straight for the study, I remind myself, some things are still exactly where they should be,